Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Finding Me on the ITV networks. Today with me is a very special guest. Professor Lewis Gordon is a professor in philosophy and Africana studies at UConn Stores. He's also a European Union visiting chair in philosophy in Toulouse, France, and he's also the Nelson Mandela Distinguished Visiting Professor at Rhodes University. A very interesting book that has recently been released, that has been written by Professor Lewis Gordon, is What Fanon Said, and that is where my particular interest was and is, of course. And when I heard Professor Lewis Gordon speaking at the University of Pretoria and then again at the University of South Africa, I was intrigued and decided to invite him to share his particular thoughts and ideas with us, especially because of the relevance of the material to the South African context and to the whole notion of black consciousness. So with that, I'd like to say good afternoon and thank you very much for being here and for sharing this time with me, Professor.
Good afternoon. I'm very happy to be here.
Great. Now, I love your t-shirt. It says unapologetically black.
Unapologetically black.
Okay. So is it important to be like affirmative in what you believe in and basically translate your belief into your action?
Absolutely. And in fact, one of the reasons I've been wearing these various t-shirts, and I quipped earlier that t-shirt companies have been writing me, asking me to wear their t-shirts, but a little riff on Biko, I wear what I like.
Okay, great.
But, you know, what I like about this shirt is it's just a little statement to a lot of black people in South Africa, because black people are always being treated as if we have to apologize for our existence. Yes. You know, it's a kind of illicit being, a constant, what are you doing here? Oh, I'm sorry, I'll go back into invisibility. So one of the things I'm encouraging a lot of black people to do is what other people do, which is don't apologize for your existence. Be who you are, walk through the world, and I don't apologize for being black. And I don't apologize for a lot of other things, because in some of my lectures, people have heard I don't apologize for being a professor. Part of the attack of black people is to tell us we should be ashamed of being intellectuals. Yeah. I don't apologize also for being a philosopher, but I also don't apologize for being a kind of intellectual who actually tries to communicate and be understood. Because as you know, part of the marketability of intellectuals today is obscurity.
Yes, exactly. And I think one of Fanon's quotes was that everybody can basically understand what you're trying to explain on the condition that you want them to understand, isn't it?
Correct. And you also must respect the intelligence of your audience. When I encounter something that's a little difficult, I try harder. Who says ordinary people don't? But the truth is, it's also the obligation of the writer to try to be as clear as possible. So it goes both ways.
I agree with that totally. Now, let's just start at the basics for the benefit of those people or the majority of the people, I think, sadly, who are unaware of who Fanon is. And that is partly because of colonialism, the removing or the obscurity, making obscure people who have influenced our thought or who can influence our thought, people like Fanon. Who is Frantz Fanon and why is it important to Africans and to people of color?
Well, one of the important reasons to know who Fanon is precisely because of the reason there was an effort to erase Fanon from history. Because Fanon stood for something, and he stood for not only liberation, but he also stood for the respect and dignity of fellow human beings. So it's something bizarre that we live in a world that we want to erase people who actually stood up for the dignity and respect of others.
Yes.
There's so many people, not only Fanon, but since I've been lecturing here, I've mentioned all kinds of intellectuals whom people in South Africa should know but don't. I was at a meeting, for instance, where all the people in the meeting said that they were Pan-Africanists, and not a single one of them knew who Anna Julia Cooper was. And she was one of the co-conveners. She organized the first Pan-African movement.
And it's true. I think not a lot of people have not heard that name, nor has it been raised.
They think of it as a male or a man's movement. There are all these women who did it, and they're not even talked about. So that was a powerful moment. But Fanon Fanon was a revolutionary and a liberation, activist wouldn't even be the right word, fighter. He was born on the island of Martinique in 1925, same year as Malcolm X. I always say vintage year for revolutionaries. He fought in World War II, as part of the French resistance, those forces. And it was interesting there because although Fanon wasn't a European, Fanon took the position that if people are degraded anywhere, he's supposed to join that struggle. He had a rude awakening when he encountered all the racism while he was fighting for humankind in France.
Yes, of course.
He subsequently became a psychiatrist, two kinds. He was a forensic psychiatrist and a clinical psychiatrist, and he was trained to be the head of psychiatric facilities in France, which took him to Algeria. In Algeria, he found himself in the unbelievably terrible situation during the beginning of the Algerian War of treating both the torturers who came to him for help from the suffering they're having from torturing people, and the tortured who are coming for him for help. So right there, he's seeing the problems of that struggle.
Yes, of course.
Fanon, though, realized, and this is something he held throughout his life, that the right response to violence is not to stand away from it and say you're no part of it, because he sees that as complicity. For Fanon, you have to choose a side. And
so you cannot be neutral.
No, he thinks neutrality is hypocrisy. Neutrality enables those who have more domination to actually massacre and destroy those who are weaker. So Fanon joined the FLN. He joined the side of the Algerians. And it's complicated to say Algerians, yes, because the Pédouins, the white settlers, called themselves Algerians too. Oh. But the fact is, France was fighting viciously to keep Algeria.
It's a colony.
It was a very brutal war, the repercussions of which are till this day, because although Fanon is actually a hero in the Francophone and the Anglophone and manyphone worlds, in France they tried to forget him. It's just that the various immigrants from North Africa, from East Africa, from around the world, and interestingly enough, a lot of the people who kept Fanon alive, believe it or not, is the population of women who have been influenced by his thought. There are a lot of women intellectuals who said Fanon inspired them. Wow. And they were, in fact, the meeting I spoke at in UNESCO on Fanon in, I think it was 2008 or 2007, was organized by a woman who wrote the foreword to this book, Sonia Dayan-Herzbren. And she is a Holocaust survivor who is an activist in France who fights on behalf of the injustices done to Palestinian causes. Wow. So you could see the complexity. She's Jewish and she fights for that. Fanon is black from Martinique and he understands these are people, and what she learned from Fanon is the importance of understanding not only injustice, but really understanding the human face behind suffering. So for Fanon, the people whose struggles he joined were not abstract revolutionaries, they were real people. What made him, of course, known is that he was also an intellectual who wrote extraordinary books. He wrote a book called Black Skin, White Mass, which has become almost a Bible of post-colonial studies. He also wrote a book called Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, which is less known, but is actually a brilliant study of how when you take control of your life, you can actually express freedom. And then one of the most influential political books of the 20th century. I mean, it's up there with books like the Communist Manifesto and, with great books like Hegel's Philosophy of Right on that scale, is Le Damné de la Terre, which is properly translated, The Damned of the Earth. But the English translators put it as Wretched of the Earth.
Yes.
And in my book, I've argued against that translation through using translations of my own. And the other thing that I did in that regard was to bring out the importance of what it is to understand what he thought. Because you see, when it comes to intellectuals of color, and especially black intellectuals, there's an obsession with our biographies, like we're just supposed to do without thinking, when in fact he was one of the great theoreticians of also how we understand our condition, not just our struggles, but our condition. So this book explores those ideas and brings to the fore Fanon as a thinker. Now, of course, such a great individual his life cannot be celebrated from his thought. So I bring them together.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Which is why it's called a philosophical introduction to his life and thought.
Okay, but in part of what you just said now, and in the lecture that you gave earlier today, is that part of this whole understanding of Fanon was that to confront your fears. And you said that one of the things that Fanon did was, one of the fears, of course, was about death. And so to confront death. Now, how do you explain that in the current context that we're looking at, for example, in South Africa, where we are, and what's happening in terms of South Africa, when I speak about in terms maybe of Marikana, and if you look at what's happened in the US recently in terms of Ferguson, the riots, etc. So how do these thoughts filter into that whole notion of confronting death? Because it's obvious, as a black man, when you go out onto the streets and you protest and you raise your voice, I mean, any person will tell you you're going to come into conflict with the law, and the law will not hesitate to take your life.
Well, the thing with Fanon is that what Fanon argued and would point out very clearly is that when states lose their legitimacy, they become more brutal. So the first thing to understand is if you see a lot of brutality, that's a sign of illegitimacy. The second thing is brutality is used in an effort to write away from you the understanding of your responsibility for your freedom. So for Fanon, he saw brutality as the world in which he was born. See, colonial worlds try to present themselves as intrinsically just and as if they're doing you a favor by colonizing you. No, Fanon basically argued that they're violating you from the beginning. And if you understand that you're being violated from just being in the colonial context, then you have to understand that to avoid dealing with that issue would be complicit in your degradation and servitude. Now, Fanon is not blaming the victim here. Fanon sees himself as trying to articulate therapy for the victim. So for Fanon, he says from his first book onward, his goal is to make human beings actional. Acting takes many forms. See, a lot of people don't realize that the protest is one model, but political work is far more vast. You need to be doing something. I brought up in my talk, for instance, that the tendency to look at leadership simply in terms of the protest or the person who's yelling or fighting fails to look at the many forms of resistance in terms of organizing, creating conditions for communities to get together. Historically, activities that are done by women activists. And because we tend to focus more on those places, we don't see those areas of leadership. You notice I was referring to Zande Radave, for instance, and her work for Black House in Soweto. But there are many like this across the country, and Fanon knew this. But in terms of these other examples, the goal in those forms of brutality is to push you outside of a human world, of human relations. And Fanon argues that oppression and colonialism is to make you forget that actually human beings need each other. You need to establish a human world.
Okay, now I have to stop you there because we have to go to a break, but when we come back, we'll raise it again from establishing a human world. We'll see you after the break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the second segment of my interview today with Professor Lewis Gordon, and we're speaking about Fanon and what Fanon said, and of course the relevance of Fanon in the context that we find ourselves today. Now, Professor, before we went into the break, you spoke about Fanon wanting to create this kind of humanity, the world in which we recognize each other's humanity, and I think that is critical to how we perceive each other. And so how does he take this conversation further?
Well, one of the things I argued is if we're going to look at someone like Fanon intellectually, then we have to think about the things he argued, the things he said, which is why the book is called What Fanon Said. Now, to understand why he said and argued certain things, we need to understand that what happened in what I call the Euro-modern world was a project to reinterpret a human being into a model that could fit neatly into capitalism. And the model that fits neatly into capitalism is to make you almost like an atom separated from every other human being. And that separation enables me to relate to other human beings as if we're just on a collision course or avoiding each other. And it means I relate to myself purely as a constellation of wants. Now, within that framework, you now have the makings of a consumer and someone who's trying to avoid others. The problem is when you're by yourself, you're completely vulnerable to the market and to state implements of power and all kinds of other ways in which you can be crushed or you can be enslaved. Now, the short version of this is that what emerged in this in the Euro-modern world was, one, an attack on the humanity of whole groups of people by making them try to force them to believe they're just property or things. Colonialism did that also. You could imagine view that you colonize the land as if there are people not on there. The second one is an obsession with freedom. And the reason there's an obsession in freedom in the Euro-modern age is precisely because it depends so much on enslavement and servitude. So you can find out who you are in contrast to the slave.
Right.
But the third is what happens when people begin to revolt and say, what are you telling me I'm not human? I'm really human. What are you telling me I don't deserve to be free? If I'm going to be angry, that's a part of my humanity. Then how do you justify that? And what happens is a crisis of justification. So Fanon as an intellectual, one, addresses questions of what does it mean to be human. Two, how that relates to questions of freedom. And three, how do the way we produce knowledge really get into a crisis of dealing with justification? An example I gave today, for instance, is that our systems of sciences, our organization of universities, our production of knowledge, imagine themselves as independent of colonialism, racism, sexism, all those things.
Yes, definitely.
If they're independent, then when we go to a post-colonial or a post-racist or whatever you call it environment, they don't think they have to change when they were actually part of that system. So Fanon was dealing with the question of the decolonization, not simply of the question of the material transformation or the legal transformation. He was also dealing with it at the level of knowledge and being itself, that we needed to decolonize the very conceptions of knowledge at work to build new relationships for a world that can actually look at the human being as a relationship.
But now if you've got this particular structure that is resistant to decolonization, which claims that it is independent of this particular entity that you're claiming it is part of, how will you then challenge this notion and start this decolonization process?
Well, there are two things. The first thing is Fanon would say that you waste your time if you try to justify it in those terms.
Okay.
So, for instance, what conditions of decolonization would a colonial order accept? Well, we have to remember colonial orders start with a premise that they're just and fair.
So you have to say they're just and fair.
That's the problem, which means then if something is just and fair, why are you changing it?
Right.
So the condition they'll accept is for you not to change it. So to prove to them that you're being just and fair, you won't get started. So Fanon said that's a waste of your time.
Yes.
The second thing Fanon says, which is something many people don't understand, if you're going to ignore that and say it's a waste of time, that side is going to interpret themselves as violated. And that's why Fanon says decolonization is always violent. What he means by that is not that you go stab up people and beat them up. It's what do you understand? Because Fanon, and I talk about this in the book, he absolutely detested violence.
Physical violence.
He detested all kinds of violence. But the thing with Fanon is it's hypocritical to do nothing about that which you detest.
Right.
Remember I said
yes.
He had a problem with death. If you have a problem with death, you need to confront it, not avoid it. Fanon saw health as dealing with your fears. If violence is detestable, do something about it. And notice that if you're doing something about it, you're going to be called violent. So the next thing that Fanon says is don't worry about that. Think about something different, which is focus on what it is to build a world that transcends violence. And this is why Fanon, people always read him on violence,
yes,
but they don't read the fact that if that were the truth, he would have just written a journal article. Why did he write a book? He wrote a book because he says, you know, even if you fight against colonization, the people who are in that struggle, their legitimacy depends on colonization.
Yes.
But if you're building a better society, you need people organically linked to a different model of what it is to be human. And this is why, sadly, sometimes the people who are the ones who fight for decolonization become the obstacles to freedom for the next generations, and which is a scary story.
Yeah, it is, because you can easily misinterpret the whole concept of when Fanon says that colonialism is violent, and so the only way to respond to it is through violence.
And that's why he's critical of what he calls spontaneity of violence. Because you see, if you respond at all, that's going to be called violence. But the thing that you have to do is you have to understand what it is to build a society. And Fanon puts it this way early in his career. He says we're also a no to colonialism. But you cannot live as a no alone. You must also be a yes. And what are you saying yes to? What kind of relationships? What kind of world? Interestingly enough, too, that's often overlooked. Fanon has a chapter on colonial disorders that are created from violence. And a lot of people don't pay attention to that. Why, if he's romanticizing violence, would he, after he talks about the national bourgeoisie, talks about national culture, all of these things, why give a chapter in which he looks at Arab and Berber Algerians committing atrocious acts of violence and going through trauma from it? If you want to romanticize violence, why do this?
Why do that exactly?
The answer is Fanon wants you to think as seriously as possible, because remember I said he detested violence.
Yeah.
So if he's going to be engaged in violence, it's because it's absolutely necessary. It's the last resort. Fanon then wants a society to ask, do you want your future to be governed by people who are under such trauma? Now think about domestic abuse. Abused men do what?
They abuse.
They abuse their wives and children.
Yeah.
Abused women do what?
Same, they abuse their spouses.
Encourage
and
abuse.
Yeah.
Fanon says, as a psychiatrist now, do not put the future of the society in the hands of abused people. Focus on the therapy, the transformation, but try to cultivate a group of people whose society is built upon something else. And the something else has to have a coherent conception of health. And for Fanon, a coherent conception of health must have within it something that has been fought against for colonized subjects and many people of color. If you look at all colonized subjects, people of color, or sexually degraded subjects, they're always referred to in the language of children.
Yes.
How can you have work to get someone healthy without a coherent notion of what it is to be an adult? The system wanted Fanon as a psychiatrist to make people happy with perpetual childhood. Fanon said, no, you got to grow up and be a woman and a man. But a woman and a man are beings who take responsibility for their existence and understand that life is doesn't always work out about fairness, but about the complex and often tragic situation of having to be responsible even for that which you did not create.
Okay, but I understand everything that you've just said and what Fanon has explained, but when you're dealing right at the start, when Fanon said that when a state uses violence, usually its legitimacy is in question. So if you're having institutions and systems that are so entrenched in these particular orders that they will use violence, and it might not necessarily be physical violence, but the other structures that they employ, which are violent responses to you trying to create this healthy society, is there any way for you to come across when you're faced with this serious contestation?
Well, here's one of the things that Fanon argues, and I've seen it happen in many instances. In my earlier lecture, I brought up this example where whenever one is trying to do something new, the previous governors say it cannot be done because they have tried it. But that presupposes the conditions under which they have tried it are permanent. They don't realize in trying it, even though they see themselves as failing, they have realigned the conditions for other generations. What Fanon actually did that was very interesting is throughout his entire career, instead of focusing on the people who hated him, because a lot of people hated him, they tried to kill him. He was often referred to in the pejorative, the end psychiatrist, even among the people with whom he was working, among fellow Algerians. What Fanon understood is that the best way to dissolve the authority of unjust institutions is through the building of alternative ones. And what's fascinating, here's an example. For instance, I wrote this book. There was a very famous big book, I call it the phallic book, because it has to be size. And the thing about that is that it has a lot of problems. Now, if I spend all my time arguing why that's a bad book, the debate is going to be centered around that book.
Exactly. And you're not offering anything new.
And you don't offer anything new. I had to sit down and write the book I thought ought to be written, and let the reader, in reading all the books, decide which book has the evidence to follow. And I'm very critical when people say things need to be done, but they're waiting for someone else to set the conditions.
Or to do it.
Right. If something needs to be done, what Fanon says, that's what about being actional, ask yourself, then just do it. Even if you do a small portion, that small portion is something someone else doesn't have to do. And that's because of another fallacy that happens. People today talk about politics as if political work is for them, and it must be achieved over their individual lifetime. If that's the way our ancestors thought, you and I wouldn't be having this conversation right now.
Okay, so I have to stop you there, because with the end now, we're going to come back for a second one, and then we'll try and conclude all of this, perhaps with a stronger message on what Fanon said and his relevance to us. But till we meet again next week, fi amanillah, wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.